I always take it as a good sign whenever we see the outside world that's not terribly concerned with low-carb dieting, ketogenic diets, and even the people who think that carnivore diets are just weird and dangerous, even if they're usually right about a lot of other concerns that they have about the state of nutrition in the modern world. I always find it reassuring when they start adopting some of our concerns, because it means that we are making headways into things, that we've gotten enough attention, even if subconsciously, that they're having to address these problems, or at the very least, they've noticed the same problems we've noticed. We got an interesting article today from a very mainstream kind of website out of the UK demanding that lawmakers tackle the problem of ultra-processed foods, pointing out a lot of the basic problems that they cause. We know that frozen pizzas and potato chips and sodas and the rest of it aren't good for people, and yet either you have in your own life, because I know I did in my own past, as do a lot of people out there, the vast majority of people, eat far too much of that stuff. These aren't occasional treats. These aren't guilty pleasures that you have once in a while when the occasion permits it. These are regular parts of people's diet. These are a predominant part of people's diets. And that's a bad thing. We know this. That shouldn't really be a controversial thing to say. And we know this is a huge problem. All you have to do is kind of pay attention when you're at the grocery store. Notice how much of the grocery store is dedicated to what we call ultra-processed foods. And notice how much people's shopping carts, when you're walking around the store, going to your, the meat section and maybe produce or dairy or whatever, depending on what variation of a low-carb diet you're following, whenever you walk around, you can't help but notice how much people are putting of that stuff in their cart. Some people, that's all they put in their cart. And I don't judge them for it. I've been there. I mean, most of us have been there. Anybody struggling with their weight has been there. But now there's getting increasing pushback from very mainstream sources on this. So let's go over one of these articles today, because they've got some issues here that are just, like, there's some barriers to what they're going to do, that what they're proposing, that are going to make it so what they're proposing isn't going to work. So we go to here from an article that was published late last week from Wired.com. And it runs the headline, "It's time to end the tyranny of ultra-processed foods. Industrially processed pizzas, cereal, and convenience foods are responsible for a host of diseases. Policymakers and doctors need to lead the food fight." Okay, yeah, I'm not going to disagree that I wouldn't call it tyranny, since technically speaking, people do have the free choice to eat other things, unless they live in a food desert or they are in some other place that just doesn't have access to food, like good quality food. And there are people in that situation. I will give you the caveat, though, that food deserts are almost always in high crime places, or if they're in an urban area, or if they're in a rural area, they're just away from any kind of civilization in general. Those are also food deserts. And those are the two kinds of problems you run into. And if you're in either of those situations, the only places you're going to be able to get food from are essentially convenience stores. And a lot of convenience stores accept food stamps, because poverty also runs high in those places. And well, we've all been to convenience stores. What can you eat there? You might luck out and find one with a hot roller where you can get a sausage or something. But otherwise, they're essentially chips and dips and some frozen foods. And that's what a lot of people eat. That's all they have access to. It's a massive social problem that no one's been able to figure out. And for them, I would say that maybe you can make the argument that they're living under a sort of a weird form of tyranny, but a lot of people who live normal related lives, they're making a free choice. And that's where people like you and people like me and everyone else comes in, to kind of put information out there, to pass on information to help people make better choices freely. And now the article goes on to describe how stuff we know, bad diet leads to obesity and heart disease and the rest of it, and how this is food wrapped in plastic. I actually found it interesting that they noted that, because you really got to get to the fringes of nutrition and health to really be worried about food being wrapped in plastic. Microplastics are something that people laugh at us for being concerned about. But here they are nodding their hat to it, giving a tip of the hat to that concern, as well as to additives and all sorts of other stuff. Now here's the problems what they're wanting. Here's our first suggestion, quote, "To solve this problem, the first thing we need to do is include in the official UK guidance," remember this is from the UK, "about nutrition the information that ultra-processed foods are associated with weight gain and diet-related diseases, and that recommendation for people is to avoid these foods. Many countries like Brazil and France already do this." End quote. Okay, First problem you're going to run into with that, in fact, you're going to have this problem repeatedly. Now, in the UK, they do have some freedom of speech. It's not like in the United States where there's a clearly enumerated constitution. In the UK, when they talk about a constitution there, that's usually more about like legal tradition and decisions made in the courts and things that aren't as clearly written down as we have here in the United States. But you're still going to run into First Amendment kinds of problems there. That essentially the businesses are going to claim that they have the right to say what they want. Now, in the UK, they're going to have an easier time overcoming this by an act of parliament, but in the United States, this would end up in the courts. I guarantee it. Labeling laws almost always end up in the courts, and the manufacturers are the ones who usually win. Usually, but not always. Here's our second suggestion, quote, limiting the marketing of ultra-processed foods is essential. We need to learn the lessons from regulating the tobacco industry and stop predatory companies selling this food to people, end quote. Good luck. Again, your First Amendment protections in the U.S. are going to stop you from that. And in the U.K., I'm sorry, but you're still going to run into problems because those industries have a huge amount of influence. They're talking about putting PepsiCo and Coca-Cola out of business. Talking about putting Kraft Heinz out of business. Good luck, especially with the push for plant-based foods, because plant-based foods are being pushed in the market by existing manufacturers of ultra-processed foods and by new companies that want to get in on the game. That's who's pushing that stuff, as well as lawmakers across the Western world. So good luck on point number 2. I wish you the best of luck. I really do. And number 3, quote, we also need to change the ultra-processed institutional food that we serve in hospitals, schools, and prisons. There is very good evidence that when feeding patients and staff in hospitals, real food is hugely beneficial. End quote. All true. But ultra-processed food is cheap. The schools run on, and prisons and hospitals and the rest all run on very tight shoestring budgets. And, I mean, good luck. There's a lot of hostility right now to the school system, and people in the United States and the UK just haven't been all that interested in prison reform of any meaningful kind. And hospitals, well, the people are kind of hostile to them too now after the last couple of years. So again, good luck. You might get the most leeway on the hospitals though because of like private funding and things. And so you may have some like people who work in them be able to push this from the inside. The next are going to be schools because of the presence of school boards. If you want to change how schools are run in general and a lot of things, get on the school board. If you care about what kind of food kids are getting fed in the public school system, as well as whatever hot button issue going on involving education right now you care about, get on the school board. It isn't that hard, actually. Those elections, people, like 95% of people don't even vote in them. So you just got to go. It's not as hard to campaign and get elected to that in most places than it is, say, Congress or your state legislature. And then the article goes on to talk about misconceptions. For instance, people who live with diet-related diseases, especially obesity, usually have a strong feeling of guilt, thinking they're the problem due to their own lack of willpower. Researchers know this isn't true. That's sort of true, but it's sort of not. And any of us who have battled weight gain and have lived a life of carrying a whole bunch of excess weight will tell you that, yeah, some of us, in some ways, it is our own fault, but at the same time, man, sugar gets its hooks into you. It's like game over. And ultra-processed foods are even worse in some ways because they are hyper-palatable combined with that sugar. And it's really hard. But we still make that choice. We still make choices, right? So there is a personal responsibility component to it, and it shouldn't be dismissed. And this doesn't really go on to talk about some social pressures going on either right now. Like we've all heard about body positivity and things, which I think are just reprehensible and really push people towards a really bad outcome. But in general, I think it's nice to see major media outlets talking about the need to really push back on ultra-processed foods. And I'm curious, do you think there's any chance whatsoever that this is going to get addressed by, people in the policy realm? I, myself, am skeptical. But, maybe I'm a bit cynical. I'm curious what you think, so let me know in the comments, please. What else did they leave out, by the way? Aside from obvious things like, keto and carnivore and the rest, what did they leave out about things that we need to do? Let me know in the comments, please. And like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, as does sharing this on social media. Helps a lot, too. I'm Anthony Stine, the Practical Carnivore. Thanks for your time today.